Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and I'm going to take a little time from grading stress this week to engage in something greatly enjoyable, which is a nice conversation with a really interesting author of a even more interesting book. So today, joining me from the great city of New York is Andrew Sillen. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in anthropology and worked for a number of years at the University of Cape Town. And the book we are going to talk about came out with Johns Hopkins University Press last year in October, so it's a little over a year old. Admittedly, I'm behind the ball on this one. It is Kidnapped at Sea, the Civil War Voyage of David Henry White. So first of all, Andrew, thank you so much for taking a little time this afternoon for you to chat about your really interesting book.
Well, thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure to be here in this
Yeah,
transatlantic conversation.
exactly. It fits the book exactly in that.
It
So
does.
for those who are not aware, David Henry White, and the story you're telling is about the C.S.S. Alabama. But I'm going to start with the really interesting question here because this is such a obscure character you're looking at. How did you come to find David Henry White?
Well, kind of randomly, I suppose. I was living in Cape Town between 1985 and 2001. And early in my time there, I walked into a cultural history museum in downtown Cape Town. And in those days, the uh, black folk were in natural history museums and the white folk were in cultural history museums. Uh, and walking by this museum, I saw a sign that said free entrance on Wednesdays. And on a flyer, I walked into this museum and I was confronted by this enormous Confederate battle ensign. And I said to myself, this is totally ahistorical. What is a Confederacy battle ensign doing in a Cape Town Cultural History Museum? And I felt as one of the few Americans in Cape Town at the time, it
Hmm.
was almost my personal responsibility to research this and to find
Wow.
out what this was all about. And I discovered that a Confederate commerce raider known as the Alabama that you referred to had traveled the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and the Indian Oceans, raiding U.S. commerce between 1862 and 1864. And on its journey in 1863, it stopped in Cape Town, where it was received with celebration. And one of the parties that was held for the officers, the captain of the Alabama, whose name was Raphael Semmes, gave this battle ensign to a ship chandler, and that found its way into the national collections. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to know what this ship was doing uh, in Cape Town and what the commerce rating was all about. Because although I had learned about the Civil War
Mhm.
in history, in high school, and in college, I knew very little about the Civil War at sea.
Mhm.
Most of what we learn about in America is about Gettysburg and Shiloh and these horrific land battles. And so I started to research this, and I discovered that the captain of the Alabama, Raphael Semmes, had written a memoir about his travels, which I read in some detail. And in that memoir, I encountered his description of a young man named David Henry White. And his description of White was that of a slave that he had captured from a Union vessel known as the Tonawanda and taken him, taken him from the Tonawanda and kept him on the Alabama, where he remained for over 600 days until the Union Navy finally caught up with the Alabama off Cherbourg on June 19th, 1864. And in a climactic battle, White tragically drowned. And so the book stems from that research, and it's about two things. It's not only David Henry White's story, it's also about how Semmes appropriated White's
Mhm.
life to tell a story about White, which conformed to the familiar racist trope of a contented slave, happy in servitude. And in reading this, I thought to myself, this cannot be true. This just does not sound right. Uh, and so I embarked upon a long-term research project, a kind of a forensic project, an
Mhm.
archival project, to find out everything I could about David White. And the bottom line is that I discovered that everything that Sims wrote about White was a lie.
Ah, well, there you have it. The typical lost cause is at work there, but and we kind of gave the spoiler away that White has a very tragic ending in the channel at Cherbourg, unfortunately.
Well, I think it's important to be upfront
Hmm.
with the message that this is a tragic story.
Hmm.
This isn't a mystery story. There's nothing fictional about this,
Hmm.
and it is frankly sad,
Yeah.
but very informative.
Oh yeah. No, I have to say I really enjoyed reading the book because it was so engaging in the way you kind of told the story of White and like weave the stories of Semmes, the Alabama, and the even Winslow and the Kearsarge into that narrative of White. And but what really struck me of like you had such it seemed like you had such a limited body of sources for White.
Yes, that's true. And that is, of course, the story of the illiterate and the disempowered. The history is written by those who can write
Mm-hmm.
in the first place. And White was illiterate. And so all that has been handed down to us is what other people wrote about him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was prepared to test all of that. And that required, as I said, a kind of a forensic approach. And I suppose I had the right mindset for it because I was trained as an archaeologist.
Mm-hmm.
And archaeologists, well, they don't necessarily use archives. They certainly are used to studying people who left no written uh, record of their lives. And so I kind of use that approach and say, well, if there's nothing written, what else is there? What can we find? And that took me to, I suppose, a dual approach. The first, which was in some ways the easiest, was archival,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was not content with Sem's statement that, oh, he was a slave. We took him from the Tonawanda. So the first question is, well, what does the census say? I mean, he,
Mm-hmm.
he was he was recorded somewhere, so
Mm-hmm.
I found him in the census, and he's recorded in the census under free
Mm-hmm.
inhabitants of Delaware. Then there are the ship's manifests,
Mm-hmm.
and the manifest of the ship he was taken from, I was able to find
Mm-hmm.
in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And those manifests not only document his station as being free, but they documented his salary and his
Right.
station. He had a job as passenger cook, which was an assistant cook. There's three cooks on the vessel, and he was a junior cook, and um, and so on. So there's the documentary evidence, but that only takes us
Mm-hmm.
so far. Uh, and I really wanted to know more about him. And I understood immediately that I could not describe what he thought. My first principle in writing the book was that I was not going to veer into fiction or into
Hmm.
historical fiction.
Hmm.
I thought that the story was so important that I had to stick to the facts.
Hmm.
This had to be a factual reconstruction. And so I didn't know what he thought, but if you can imagine the mind as something like a
Hmm.
vessel, I didn't know what was in the vessel,
Hmm.
but I knew the forms, the walls of the vessel, the forms
Hmm.
from which the vessel was
Right.
made. And I could describe the forces acting upon him.
Hmm.
And while I couldn't describe what he thought, I could describe what he experienced
Hmm.
because we know where the Alabama went. We
Right.
know what various people said about him.
Hmm.
We know how the Alabama was received in the various
Hmm.
ports that it visited. And in describing all of those phenomena, it was possible to paint a picture of White's predicament. So it's not a biography in a conventional sense,
Hmm.
but it is a revelation about his experiences.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, it is still somewhat biographical, even if the character you write about doesn't really have the depths of voice that you usually would have in a biography. It's a creative biography, it's that.
Indeed, I describe him as a ghost.
Yeah. I think, isn't there, I'm kind of tempted to look behind me here. I think one of the books on Sims is called, where he's called a
Ghost
ghost.
ship.
Yeah.
Well, the Alabama was often referred to as the ghost ship.
Hmm. Yeah, he's elusive.
Yeah.
Just appears somewhere and disappears again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's sort of, and as you were talking and you're kind of talking about like I didn't want to be into fiction or kind of go and kind of even try and imagine what went through his mind. I kind of was thinking back to like it's right there behind me actually. I can also almost point to it somewhere. William Freeling in I think it was his first book, he kind of was very creative and sort of sometimes making up conversations based on the records we had. So it's sort of interesting that you were like, no, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to try and even assess what was through his mind. So that sounds very much like you're thinking about this as sort of an academic history.
Well, my thinking was that I wasn't going to do all the work, and I was going to let the reader do some of the
Mm,
work.
mm,
So, uh, to the extent that I'm describing the experiences and the forces acting upon him, I expect the reader to put him or herself in
mm.
White's place, and that would be the source of the revelations.
Oh, nice. Okay. That definitely works. I could
I'm
send
glad to hear
I could tell
it.
myself sometimes thinking in those mo terms when he's on board to Alabama and like the way he might be treated or things he's seeing on board the ship. That, but we'll get there. But
Mhm.
you did mention it before we started, sort of conversationally, that your aim was sort of to kind of address both the kind of popular and the academic history side. And where do you feel like this? Like, I guess A, I should say, how did you do that, and where do you see the strengths of doing it that way?
Right. Well, I thought it was incredibly important to tell his story,
Hmm.
but given the politics around Black history and revelation of Black history, I wanted to make sure that it was bulletproof
Mm.
in terms of um, the historical accuracy
Hmm.
of what was going on. So, in order to do that, I had to conduct a pretty academic exercise
Hmm.
of archival research, which in some ways is inimical or inconsistent with a trade book with large reach. I wanted to marry the rigor of academic research to the reach of uh, a popular book. And I think that was probably the most significant challenge of the book for me. And I um, arrived at an unconventional approach, which is I wrote the book as a triptych. So, you know what a triptych is? A triptych is a three-panel piece of art in which the center story is the main
Mhm,
story, and the panel on the left and the right uh, are adding to the
mhm,
narrative. And so the book does not proceed like a conventional historical narrative. Rather, the story of White's voyage,
mhm,
which is at the center of the book, is literally in the center of the book.
mhm,
And the introduction of the book, part one, is the academic context and historical
mhm,
context. Then we have the story, and then the right panel, part three,
mhm,
is my analysis
mhm.
of both the historiography and White's actual story. So I understood at the time that it was conventional, and I wasn't even sure it was going to work, but I couldn't figure out any other way to do it.
Yeah. No, I think it's considering I'm currently grading IB exams and writing a lot of comments saying you need a better conclusion, that your conclusion doesn't kind of give
Mm-hmm.
an implication or doesn't talk about the kind of larger question you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed the conclusion where you kind of list, I think it was 8 or 10 points where Sam's biography is just outrightly incorrect and
The 10 lies.
yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
10 lies and just it's a wonderful conclusion because you kind of remind the reader of like, okay, this is all the things that I told you of like where Sam's got it wrong intentionally.
There's another difference from the conventional narrative. I don't, I think most academics who would have written this book would have started with Sems's text,
Hmm. Oh yeah.
in which he describes White and then systematically disproved it.
Mm.
I decided early on that no, I was going to let the reader get to know White
Hmm.
before I told the reader what anybody wrote about him.
Hmm.
And in that way, make the um, revelation of the lies more personal and internal for the reader, yeah, rather than something that is um, uh, proposed at the beginning
Right.
by the
Yeah.
author. Mhm.
Yeah. So it is a bit of a mystery that unravels over time, which is nice. Uh, so I sometimes ask this question more towards the end, but I'm going to do it now because I think this is a perfect place to do this because obviously there's a lot of parts of White's life we will never know. A lot of aspects of White's thinking we will never be able to uncover. But kind of just thinking of like the limited stuff you had, is there
Mhm.
anything where you kind of were like, I wish I would have had this? Like, is there any
Oh,
piece where you
sure.
kind of were like, if I only could find this one little piece that could be so amazing? We can do two or three if you want.
Well, I think that there is more information to be learned about White in Delaware, in
Mm,
Loomis,
hmm.
Delaware, where
Hmm.
he grew up. And you know, that might be in any well, he had no descendants, obviously, because he died as a teenager, but his family may still, descendants of his parents
Mm,
may still be living in Delaware or elsewhere.
right.
And there might be some family papers or some
Mm,
family Bibles or some other material
hmm.
that is there. And I had to decide, was I going to take another couple of years to try and find that stuff, or you know, at some point these projects are never finished; they're only abandoned, and it, someone else must take up the
Mm,
torch at this stage. So that's one place where there may be more information.
Hmm.
Uh, in terms of uh, the voyage itself and his encounters, I did a pretty thorough scrub of all of the consul reports
Mm.
from the various ports where the Alabama visited. And
That's
I
painful.
was really hoping that one of the consuls would have mentioned
Mm.
encountering him.
Mm.
And you think that they might have, because White's kidnapping, although, it's been lost to history, but it was
Mm.
pretty well known at the time.
Mm.
It was in the New York newspapers and the Philadelphia newspapers, and the consuls would have known about it.
Mm.
Uh, and if they had encountered White, they probably would have written about it. And I
Mm.
really looked hard for that, but couldn't find it. Now, what makes that interesting is it's a kind of a negative evidence,
Mm.
because although I don't have any more information about him, what it tells me is that Semmes's assertion that
Mm.
he was free to leave the ship at any port he visited was a lie. So even the absence of information becomes positive information.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Then I have done research in the consular archive materials, and it's not that can be a very frustrating surge. The the hours you might pour over letters, and there's just trade
Mm-hmm.
reports. No,
Yeah, and somebody's 19th century bad handwriting. It can be.
yes. Oh yeah, or like a bad photograph of on microfilm. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh, like the
yeah.
you probably looked at the ones from Singapore, and oh, I have so many bad microfilm pictures of that. It's it's terrible.
Yeah.
Um, so at which stage, because you have in which don't really remember which chapters this is in. It's like in
Hmm.
the later part of the book. You have like a series of photographs that were taken in South Africa, Simonstown,
Hmm.
by Arthur Green. And at which stage of the research did you find those?
Fairly late.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
I started this research when I was in Cape Town
Mm-hmm.
in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had day jobs. So I didn't really do this full time, on and off. When I had a chance, I'd go down to Lewis. When I had a chance, I'd go to Philadelphia to the archives. And then when I had retired, and then the COVID uh, situation came about, I was finally trapped in my apartment with nothing else to do, and I was able to write the book.
Oh, it's a COVID
Uh,
book too.
the COVID book, yes. About, I would say, about 2 years before the COVID book, I was uh, scanning the internet for pictures of the Alabama
Mm-hmm.
everywhere I could, and that didn't come up. Nothing came up that included White. There were a lot of interesting pictures of the Alabama,
Mm-hmm.
but just as we discussed earlier, history is written by people who write.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Photography is generally directed towards people who are perceived to be important. So there are lots of pictures of the officers that are readily available, but there was nothing that I could see that was White.
Mm-hmm.
At one stage, I went to the archives in Cape Town to look at the original Arthur Green photos.
Mm-hmm.
And I found one photo which could have included White.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's very difficult to tell because, as I say in the book, skin tones are almost impossible to determine from old black and white pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cape Town picture was not definitive in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Then, while I was writing the book during the COVID epidemic,
Mm-hmm.
I engaged in a deeper dive into Liverpool
Hmm. Yeah.
because the Alabama had, I'm sorry, the first boat that White was on was known as the Wyoming. And the
Hmm.
Wyoming had traveled to Liverpool, and White had spent 2 or 3 weeks in
Hmm.
Liverpool until he got his next gig on another packet ship going back to Philadelphia. So I started to research everything I could about Liverpool in 1862.
Hmm.
And then in the online archives of the Liverpool Museum, I found another set of photographs that were not in the Cape Town collection for some reason, even though they were also taken by Arthur Green.
Huh.
And this was, to me, a revelation. I'd known about the Green photographs for years, but I didn't
Yeah.
know about the Liverpool one.
Hmm.
And one particular Liverpool photograph was particularly revealing and had an individual which, for a number of reasons, I'm quite certain was white.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's sort of like, but did you get like that because you have the photograph in the book, and then
Mhm.
you zoom in with two more pictures, and maybe I can put them
Right,
over me here so that people can who watch the video can see this on
right,
YouTube.
right.
And did you kind of digitally do that? Did they make a big scan for you?
Well, the Liverpool Museum made a high resolution JPEG available to me.
Okay.
And then it was a simple matter to simply zoom in.
Hmm.
And the way I published it was in three panels. First,
Hmm.
there's the picture. And if you were just to look at the picture casually,
You don't see it.
uh, you would only see the officers in the front.
Yeah.
And if you go to a second level of depth, uh, you also see an officer in the ship's
Hmm.
wheel, and in the background, some people at the back of the ship that just seem like the books in the background of our videos
Yeah.
here. But if you zoom in to the back, then
Hmm.
all of a sudden you see that there is a young black individual
Hmm.
amongst the other. Um, the station was boys.
Yeah.
There were 4 or 5 of them in the picture, and White is among them. And
Hmm.
he is the only black one, and so it's quite clear that it's him.
Yeah.
And it's not that these things are all that difficult to find. I think that the most important thing is to ask the right question.
Hmm.
You got to go looking.
Right. Yeah.
And once I went looking, there it was.
Right. And just sort of like the lucky find of like looking into that Liverpool collection
Mhm.
and finding additional photographic, in this case, imagery. So how did you feel like in that moment? Like you're in the late stages of writing the book and you finally have a picture of the man.
That was dancing around the room.
I I can imagine people were like thinking, well, everyone was bottled up and he's dancing upstairs. What's going on? Oh yeah. No, I can imagine that's like great moment of joy. Finally can put a face to the abstract image you're studying. So let's talk about Whiteson. We've been talking about him sort of, but
Mhm.
let's talk about a little bit more with sort of what his life was like. And so he is a free person of color from a
Mhm.
slave state like Delaware.
Yeah, Delaware was unusual. Maryland too. They were middle ground states.
Hmm.
So, we're familiar with the South, the Deep South, uh, where slavery was economically um, overwhelming in the first part of the 19th century. There was the cotton boom was very significant. In fact, it amounted to 40% of American exports, and it depended upon slavery. And over 95% of black people in the Deep South states were slaves. Delaware was different. Delaware was a slave state, but it had no cotton and it had no rice. and slavery was becoming uneconomical, because it had been economical when Delaware was producing tobacco, but tobacco was very hard on the soil. And by the middle of the 19th century, the farmers were really struggling. They could not support
Mhm.
uh, their slaves, and they realized that it was uh, well, there were two options. One was to sell their slaves south, and many did that, or to emancipate them. And the result was that by the 1860s, uh, over uh, 80, 90% of Delaware's black population was free. Very unusual. Uh, uh, Now, white came from that black population. Just because he was free doesn't mean he was not subject to oppression,
Mhm.
because Delaware had very extreme black codes
Mhm.
which limited education and movement. And the result was that folks like Black were illiterate, and many of them, not all, but many, were trapped in cycles of poverty,
Mhm.
because what white farmers would do, they couldn't support their slaves, but they could hire Black folk for farm labor for small times of the year when they needed to harvest or corn and that sort of thing. So there was ephemeral work, but there wasn't really sustainable work, and poverty was pretty much the rule, and
Mhm.
illiteracy.
Yeah.
Delaware also had this very strange series of laws. They needed black labor, but they were terrified that blacks would leave the state and have the experience of freedom and come back and transmit that information
Mm.
to their slaves. And so it made it very difficult for blacks to leave the state and come back.
Mm.
But there was an exception to the law. And the law, when white left in 1860, was that if a free black left the state for more than 30 days or 60 days, I can't remember, um, then they could not come back. Or if they came back, they
Mm.
were subject to incredibly heavy fines,
Mm.
and even indenture,
Mm.
if they couldn't pay the fine, with the exception of those who went to sea. So Delaware made an exception because there was a need for maritime labor.
Mhm.
And White took advantage of that exception by getting a gig on this Philadelphia packet ship, which made it legal for him to leave the state and to be able eventually to come back. And one of the sad parts of his story is that while he's at sea, the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed, and Delaware was terrified that it would be overrun by blacks coming up from the South. And so they tightened up the law, and they made it so that once you left the state, you couldn't come back, even if you went to sea, unless it was on a boat owned by a Delaware businessman. And as a result, White never even had the opportunity to return to Delaware, even if he wanted to.
Well, oh my gosh. That could have they could have gone turned even into a even more complicated story if he had returned. Um, but you kind of when he's hired on the Cope Line
The
boat,
Tonawanda. Mm-hmm.
Tonawanda and Wyoming first,
Mm-hmm.
you also kind of point to sort of like what something that I guess sort of could cause confusion about his status as what is he, because I think it said that one of the classifications that he was operating under was servant.
No, he was his technical position on the manifests of both ships is a passenger cook.
Hmm.
Now, in on packet ships of the time, on co-packet ships, there were it was quite normal for um, black sailors to sign on as teams.
Mm,
And this was a team of cooks.
hmm
So there were three cooks who traveled as a team. There was the cook, the assistant cook, and the passenger cook. And he was a passenger cook, which is the entry level position, akin to what in a kitchen today you'd call a commis chef. That is a one who prepares
hmm
for the other cooks. And he served that way on both vessels. And it was a pretty clever and positive thing for him to do. For one thing, Delaware was getting dangerous. Lewis was getting dangerous. The Civil War was had begun in the middle states like Maryland and Delaware. Every single town was getting armed up, and there were militias, both northern and southern militias, in almost every town. Nobody knew if Lee's army would invade Delaware, and Lewis was an obvious target because it was on the gateway to Delaware Bay and Philadelphia. So it was getting hot there. It was a good time to get out of Dodge. That's one issue. And the other issue is that it was a really good gig. He had a really good salary for its day. I mean, $15 a month may not sound like much, but it's more than sailors were paid in the Union Navy. It was more than the lowest position of boy was paid. So it was not, it was a junior cook position, but it wasn't a junior position.
hmm
And, uh, and it was regular pay because the Cope line ran ships back and forth between Philadelphia and Liverpool every month.
hmm
So it was also potentially career building because he
Right.
had taken an entry level position. And one of the fellows he traveled with, Luke White, had previously had the entry level position and
Mm,
had moved up. And finally, it was safe because the Cope line was owned by Quakers
mm,
and they were abolitionists.
yeah.
One
I,
other thing I discovered, which is quite extraordinary and really a bit of revealed history, is that his two companions, Luke White and William Cannon, had traveled with another gentleman, Thomas Fisher, many times on Cope voyages. And he was a courier of abolitionist literature as part of a network of black sailors who transmitted abolitionist literature between British and American white and black abolitionists all throughout the 1850s and 1860s.
oh,
So
wow.
he had taken a safe position with folks that were perhaps related and certainly
Mm,
trusted on a safe vessel that offered career opportunities and good salary.
wow, yeah. Didn't quite turn out sad, but that we'll get there.
Yeah.
How do you become a cook on a ship?
Well, he had served, I think where you got the word servant was when he was in Delaware.
Mhm.
He had a job. Remember, there's no schooling
No.
for teenage blacks in Delaware.
Mm-mm.
It was, you had to work.
Mm-hmm.
So he got a job as a quote servant in a hotel in Lewis called the Atlantic Hotel. But that hotel closed in 1862 because of the Civil War. There was no more tourism. So,
Surprise.
so the tourist town even then. And without that job, uh, he had to find something else. Now, he didn't wait for the hotel to close. He left 2 or 3 months before the hotel closed.
Mm,
He apparently saw it coming, and presumably he uh, heard or was informed of an opportunity
mm,
on the Copeland vessel Wyoming because his name seems to be substituted for another individual at the last minute. So it
Oh, yeah, he
seems
puts that
like
in the
the
manifest.
opportunity came and he went for it.
Hmm. Right, because you actually put the manifest in into the what is it,
Yeah,
William Danes Downs
yeah,
or something. It's
yeah. His
crossed
name's
out.
crossed out, and White's name is
Oh
written in.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it
It
was a last second thing, and again, who knows what he thought, but
right.
it does seem logical that with Lewis getting really dangerous and hot, and
Hmm.
with the work closing down, if
Right.
the opportunity came up for a position, he would have
Hmm.
jumped at it. And it
Yeah.
was, quite normal for blacks from that region, Lewis and from Sussex County, to get work as sailors out of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So he was obviously part of some network where he was alerted to the possibility
Well, there's
of
also some
job.
adventure in this, like travel the ocean and see another
Sure.
country. So, and
Mm.
he does go to Liverpool, which is a very pro-Southern town in Great Britain during this time, considering. But
Well, Liverpool's interesting too, and I write about it. I think things change. Yes, Liverpool was pro South, mainly pro South
mm,
in the war. There were also Northern sympathizers, but when compared to London, for example, where
oh
there
yeah,
was a lot more understanding of the political complexities
hmm
of siding with the South, Liverpool's economy fully depended upon cotton, and so there was really tremendous
hmm
sympathy. But one thing that I found was very fascinating is that the folks that wrote about Liverpool in the 1850s,
hmm
uh, and the two that I mentioned are Herman Melville
hmm
and a man named William Powell, who was a free black intellectual
hmm
who left America because of what he said was a war declared on the colored population. He went to Liverpool to raise his children. And both Melville and Powell said that in the 1850s, there was a lot of racial tolerance and a lot of um, uh, comfort for blacks compared to what they experienced in American cities.
hmm
And in fact, Melville says, I saw a black man walking with a white woman in Liverpool who would have been torn to pieces in New York,
hmm
but it was okay in Liverpool. But that was in the 1850s.
hmm
Then I found another text from Dickens, Charles Dickens,
hmm
who went on a pub crawl in Liverpool in 1862. And he describes a completely different situation, whereas all the blacks had to stick together because if they walked down the street individually, they were
hmm
liable to be attacked.
hmm
So it appears to me that the atmosphere changed as the Civil War approached from one of tolerance to intolerance. And Liverpool was quite an exciting place
Right.
during the Civil War with a tremendous amount of conflict.
Yeah. It's kind of sad that you can't really place White anywhere because you kind of mentioned like he might have been in you don't really know where he could have stayed during this time. It's sort of like the different.
It's unfortunate, and there's a place where we've lost some uh, potential archival information. Liverpool Sailors' Home was one place he might have stayed, but the manifest of that establishment has long been lost. I looked
Yeah,
for it but couldn't find it.
yeah.
Mm, what are you
And
going to do?
so he makes his journey with Wyoming over to Liverpool. He comes back from over to Philadelphia, and
Hmm.
it it sounded like he wasn't intended initially to go on the Tonawanda, but that sort of the opportunity opened up and he right went for it.
No, I think it's the other way around. I think he didn't intend to go into Wyoming, but the
Mm,
opportunity came up and he
Okay.
went for it.
Mm,
Then, once he did that, he was in the Cope line system,
mm,
and the Cope line had these regular vessels going back and forth. So he had regular work. He had a
mm,
2 or 3 week layover in Liverpool.
mhm,
Then he got back to Philadelphia, where he had a week layover before taking the Tonawanda back to Liverpool.
mm,
And one of the points that I make in the book, which I think is really central to the
mm,
story, is that the week he was in Philadelphia between
mhm,
the arrival of the Wyoming and the departure of the Tonawanda was one of the most important and consequential weeks in all of American history because it was the week that Lincoln announced the draft Emancipation
mhm,
Proclamation. And that was in all of the Philadelphia newspapers.
mm,
And those newspapers would have been in the mailbags of the Tonawanda.
mhm,
And I believe that that is part of Semmes's motivation
mhm,
for taking White
mm,
because he would have been enraged by the Emancipation
mm,
Proclamation.
mm,
And so um, his reaction to it was to say, in effect, well, if the North can take our slaves, we'll take their slaves. But in order for him to do that, he needed a slave.
mm.
So he simply enslaved white.
Yeah. Kidnapping, as it as you rightfully call it.
Mm-hmm.
And at, at that point in the book, you kind of bring the story of Semmes and what Semmes has sort of his background, but I want to stick with White and on the Tonawanda. And Semmes already has captured a number of ships by the time he gets to the
Mm-hmm.
Tonawanda. I don't think the people yet know that he is active because it's a very short window in which all of these captures are taking place.
Mm-hmm.
So he captures the Tonawanda. It's not the only ship he captures in this moment. And then there's a storm coming.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
Like it seems
the
like a massive logistical undertaking that is going on here.
yeah, his modus operandi was to fly an English flag
Mm,
and approach a vessel. And the normal course of events in the merchant marine, you raise a flag, and then the other ship raises its flag. So
mhm,
you would fly an English flag. The uh, a whaling ship might raise the American flag, and then Semmes would drop the English flag and raise the Confederate flag and fire a cannon across the bow and
mhm,
capture the whaler. And then he would take all of the crew on board the Alabama, put them in irons on the deck, and then burn the whaler. And he did that, I don't know, half a dozen times or so before he encountered the Alabama. I'm sorry, the Tonawanda. And by the time he encountered the Tonawanda, he also had the crew of all of these whaling ships on board. So, so but he had a problem with the Tonawanda, which is that Tonawanda had passengers.
mhm,
The Tonawanda was a packet. A packet carried
mhm,
both cargo and passengers, 50 passengers or so. So he couldn't just burn it the way he could burn the whalers. And what he ends up doing is taking all of the folks from the vessels he had previously captured, and he eventually puts them on the Tonawanda, and he lets the Tonawanda go, but without White. Tonawanda reaches Liverpool, and the captain, whose name was Theodore Julius, immediately reports White's kidnapping. Tonawanda had no trouble getting back to Liverpool because it was sailing east
mhm,
out of the uh, danger of North Atlantic storms.
mhm.
But in October in the North Atlantic, as you know, hurricanes move up the coast.
Yeah, bends in
And,
between them.
and Semmes, even though he, it might sound strange to those of us who are used to NOAA and weather reports, but SEMS had warning
Hmm.
that a hurricane, or what they used to call a cyclone, was moving up the coast, and nevertheless doggedly sailed west because he wanted to attack shipping in New York Harbor.
Hmm.
And so, ignoring the signs of the storm, he continued to sail west. White had been kidnapped on October 9th.
Hmm.
Sims goes straight into the eye of a hurricane on the 16th. What is today? The 15th.
Yeah, yeah,
So
tomorrow.
yeah, of October. And then there is a few days of terror. So,
Mm.
imagine White's emotional state. He'd spent much of his life in fear of being kidnapped,
Right.
as was common for free blacks in Delaware. He gets on this safe vessel,
Hmm.
uh, competently run,
Hmm.
and he undergoes the trauma of kidnapping.
Right.
No doubt he undergoes the trauma of being what they used to call seasoned, that
Hmm.
is, tortured into
Hmm.
submission, and then he encounters having
Hmm.
the terror of living through, sailing straight through the eye of a hurricane.
Yeah, that's the moment where you as a reader kind of start kind of placing yourself in his feet, shoes, and kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
good God, what did you get yourself into here?
Mm-hmm.
Like um, I can't even imagine, on a more modern ship to go through a hurricane, much less one of those rickety things like the Alabama would have been.
Yeah, well, sometimes they don't make it, like the Pharaoh.
No,
Mm-hmm.
no, exactly. Uh, and it's such a, I mean, the story is tragic with his end, but it's also a tragic moment that you have this individual who constantly watched over his shoulder and then gets kidnapped in that what seems like a safe place on the ocean. Like it's unfathomable, right? Like
Mm.
he, yeah. Maybe it's
Mm.
more fashionable these days with all these things going on in the country.
It's tragic. It's ironic and it's tragic.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
definitely. Um, so now he's on the Alabama, and
Mm-hmm.
it you spent a good bit of time explaining SEMS and the environment on the Alabama. And I think it's important to kind of realize for listeners who are maybe not as familiar with the Confederate Commerce Raiders that most, if not all of the individuals on board are not Confederates.
Correct. Yeah. The Confederacy conceived a plan to retaliate against the North's blockade of southern ports by building these raiders, and there were about four or five of them. Uh, Two or three were constructed in Liverpool, and they were phenomenally successful. I mean, we're
Mhm.
as I mentioned earlier, we're all familiar with the Civil War on land and the horrific battles and the carnage at Shiloh and so on. But we don't really learn about the Civil War at sea.
Mhm.
And although there was less carnage, it was in many ways just as important as what was
Mhm.
going on land, because the war had devolved into one of attrition,
Mhm.
much like the Russian Ukrainian conflict. A
Mhm.
whole lot depended upon which countries would recognize the Confederacy and
Mhm.
trade with it.
Mhm.
And so, whether the South appeared to be successful at this or not, uh, had tremendous diplomatic repercussions. And the success of the Alabama in the first couple of years of the war materially contributed to European sympathy for the South. And after all, the economies of England and France uh, largely depended on
Mhm.
cotton trade.
Mhm.
So it was a high bar to to not trade with the Confederacy. And White is now witness to the Alabama's cruise in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. And over this cruise, over about 600 days, the Alabama either, but not all of the ships, just the Alabama, two or three more, but the Alabama sinks, destroys, bonds, takes out of service 64 Union vessels, merchant marine vessels, and a warship.
Mhm.
It causes half of the American merchant marine to find foreign flags
Mhm.
and a 500% rise in maritime insurance. And it was said that the American merchant marine, the vibrant merchant marine before the war, never recovered
Mhm.
really from the disaster. So it was enormously effective. Now,
Mhm.
White was witness to all of this, but he was also witness to how the Alabama was received in the
Mhm.
various ports that the Alabama visited. And in each of those ports, there's a story to tell. And I conceive of those stories as a curriculum in servitude.
Mhm.
Um, he did not have schooling in
Mhm.
literature, but he had schooling in servitude. And I'll just give you one example of that. Uh, they're in um, Port Royal in Jamaica. And previously, the Alabama had vanquished uh, a, a, a Union gunboat called the Hatteras off Galveston Bay. And Hatteras was sunk, and Alabama had saved, had rescued uh, virtually everyone from the Hatteras who were on board in irons as the vessel uh, sailed through the Yucatan Channel and made its way to Jamaica, sails into Port Royal, and the captain of the Hatteras is still on board. He was saved and he's on board, but he hasn't been released yet. So as the Alabama docks in Port Royal Harbor, which was British colony at the time, a British naval band welcomes the Alabama with a beautiful, sweet rendition of Dixie. And the the captured captain of the Hatteras, objects that this is, a diplomatic incident. Objects to the sympathetic portrayal of the South with playing of Dixie. And so the band responds. They play Yankee Doodle, but with such a cacophonous imitation of musicality that all of the Confederate officers are in stitches. They're holding their sides. They're trying not to laugh so hard. So this is like a musical demonstration
Mhm.
of the sympathy for the South.
Mhm.
And there is no question that White would have witnessed that.
Yeah.
So, and there are stories like that throughout the book.
Right. And there's the sympathy that the vessel is received with, but then the crew is a really troublesome group.
Oh yes, you asked me about the crew.
That's all
Yeah,
right.
well, the
I like
South
that
had a
story too.
South had a problem. They had conceived of this plan to raid Union commerce. They had plenty of officers.
Hmm.
In fact,
Too many.
the American Navy before the war was very well populated with Southern officers. But the South had no merchant marine. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just to make it vivid, the North had something like 500 million tons of um, merchant marine vessels, and the South had maybe 500,000. And most of those were owned by Northern merchants. So the implication of that was that they didn't have crews
Mm-hmm.
to spare, and these vessels required 100 people to run. So their solution was to hire mercenaries. And the best place to get those mercenaries was Liverpool. So the vessel and the other raiders had this strange um, agglomeration of very, very diverse officers and crew. So the officers were empowered Southern gentlemen,
Mhm.
mainly slave owners. I'll come back to that in a second. And Earl,
Mhm.
British and European mercenaries who would do just about anything for
Mhm.
money and a job. Uh, and that caused a tremendous amount of cultural
Mhm.
clashing, as you might imagine, including mutiny and all sorts of hijinks.
Mhm.
And White had to navigate this. And
Mhm.
one of the interesting things about his predicament is the way these boats were built, and some things still are built. The officers uh, inhabited the rear of the vessel. That's
Mhm.
where they ate, where their mess was, and that's
Mhm.
where they slept. And the crew slept in the front of the vessel,
Mhm.
in the forecastle, and that's where the galley was
Mhm.
as well. And there was no communication between the two. You could only go on the top deck, and so there was this physical separation
Mhm.
of cabin of officers and crew. And White was one of the very few individuals, and there couldn't have been more than three or four of them, who slept in the front with the
Mhm.
crew, but worked in the back with the officers.
Mhm.
And so he had to navigate
Mhm.
all of those conflicts.
Mhm.
And that must have been a very tricky um, uh, job. It appears from what little people have written about him that he was well liked by everyone.
Mhm.
So somehow he did manage to navigate those issues.
Yeah, but I mean, you can imagine how much potential bullying there's going on of like you're sort of the officer's favorite or
Yeah, exactly. Cooks, I mean, well, stewards. He was a steward on the island.
hmm
Stewards were often, attacked for being the officers. Yeah.
yeah. And it I guess the Alabama's lucky in that Sims never allowed a mutiny to happen. Although you recount at least one episode I remember that it got really
Mhm.
close.
Well, yeah, there was a mutiny. There were a lot of problems. For one
Mm.
thing, the crew were mercenaries and Earl to begin with. For another, they were never paid,
hmm
and it was a kind of an unspoken, rebellion. Third, they were well, a lot of them were alcoholics. There was you know, an alcohol bred misbehavior and hijinks in all sorts of ways. So there was one incident in Martinique where the crew, well, one individual managed to sneak on board a couple of gallons of rum, and much of the crew got drunk and attacked some officers, throwing belaying pins and that sort of thing. And eventually, order was restored. But when it was restored, the hooligans were punished with water torture and with spread eagling. And White would have seen all of this. And I remind the audience that who reads the book that these individuals were tortured, and they were white, right? Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
one could
yeah.
only imagine the kind of punishment he might have been subject to,
hmm
and it strains credulity to imagine that he might have been better treated than the white folks.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be a little bit like no, he's definitely knowing that he would suffer really harsh punishment here. Um, so. but yeah, this is an interesting situation, right? The crews never paid. I guess the promise of like the prize money that they eventually could get
Hmm.
will keep them loyal to a degree at this stage.
Hmm.
And then Sam's made this decision to go into the Indian Ocean and towards like China.
Hmm.
And as you say, like it just dries up. The rating just is becoming less and less successful. And the crew is getting less happy.
Yeah, and the I suppose the bottom line is that the voyage has no end. It
Right.
just goes on and on and
Hmm.
on. And I even cite in Melville's book, Redfern, he starts out by saying the happiest phrase that a sailor ever hears is "homeward bound,"
Hmm.
and the joy in hearing "homeward bound." This vessel had no homeward bound. It just went on and on and on, and into the Indian Ocean to Singapore. So,
And
uh,
I guess that's sort of the other part that the ship is constructed in 1862. It
mhm,
operates for about 2 years without
mhm.
maintenance, constantly on the water, constantly going. That and it's chasing down enemy. It's chasing down enemy commerce ships. He's racing through storms. It's like
Oh,
it's like taking your Civic on a racetrack every day for 2 years. It takes a toll on the ship.
yeah, all the time capturing vessels and taking their crew and putting them in irons,
Hmm.
and and yes, by the end, towards the end of the cruise, it was clear that they had to go into port to rest and refit.
Hmm.
The steam engine was badly needed service.
Oh God.
The ship was slow. The bottom was fouled with barnacles,
Hmm.
um, and and as you point out, the returns were lessening, and part of the reason for that, there were two reasons. One is the ship was now slow,
Hmm.
so it could be outrun. It used to
Right.
be just about the fastest ship on the water. The only thing that could beat it was a clipper ship.
Hmm.
Everything else, couldn't do 15 knots, and this one could. So, that was one issue. The crew was exhausted,
Hmm.
and they were not well trained. And part of that was that they couldn't be trusted. So there were no hand arm drills because the officers couldn't trust them with the arms.
Yeah.
So that was an issue, uh, and uh,
I guess
and
lucky
so
they
on.
never had to do a boarding under fire.
Well, there was another issue which really goes to the ultimate fate of the Alabama, which is Alabama had two really important design innovations. One was um, speed. It had
Hmm.
steam and wind, and it was so superbly designed that it could fly across the water. That's
Hmm.
why it could take out so many vessels. It
Hmm.
beat everybody except the clippers. But the other was a really interesting innovation with regard to potable water.
Hmm.
And that is that it was one of the first vessels to have a steam driven condenser. So they could turn seawater
Hmm.
into fresh water,
Hmm.
right? About a pound of coal, they could get a gallon of water.
Hmm.
And that meant they didn't have to stop so often in
Hmm.
ports for fresh water. Another contribution to the ghost ship concept,
Right.
right? How do you find it on the trackless ocean without radar? So,
Yeah.
so, so that was a big part of its success. But there was a flaw, and the flaw was that the water tanks from the condenser were placed adjacent to the ammunition stores. And the result of that was that the ammunition got damp.
Hmm.
And towards the end of the voyage, they tested the ammunition against uh, uh, a cargo ship called the Rockingham, that had
mm,
cargo of guano, and they had cannon aiming practice uh, out in the South Atlantic on the Rockingham, and 1 in 3 shells failed to explode.
mm,
And the ones that did were smoky and kind of meh.
mhm,
They didn't have nice sharp uh, reports. And this dampness was noted by the officers. They knew about it, uh, and they nevertheless eventually went into battle. But
mhm,
when the battle finally came, uh, so many of the shells failed to explode, it
mm.
contributed to the Alabama's demise. So this long, long, long voyage could not have gone on forever.
Which is interesting because, and you mentioned it too from Sims's kind of autobiography, that
Mhm.
he kind of accuses Winslow and the Kearsarge by having these chains on the hull as sort of
Oh
like,
yeah.
oh, you're fake ironcladding it, and that made our
Hmm.
shells less reliable and less
Hmm.
able to pierce you. But it sounds like it's more of a self-made problem that he couldn't do much damage.
Yeah, that was rubbish. Semmes was a great one for recrimination and
Hmm.
for not accepting responsibility and blame. And he uh, managed to blame everything and everyone except himself
Mm.
whenever there was a failure. And
Right.
I mean, the Battle of Cherbourg, that's a whole story. But
Mm.
uh, yeah, he quite recklessly, but I would say totally in character,
Mm.
quite recklessly engaged in the battle, knowing
Mm.
that his ammunition was damp,
Right.
knowing that his crew was undertrained,
Mm.
knowing that his ship was slow, and knowing that he was at a disadvantage.
Mm. Well, and you don't say it you don't say it in your book, but it sounds very much like that he knew that this battle would not go in his favor based on sort of the interactions that he seems to have had with that captain of the Deerhound.
Of the Kears, oh
No,
yes.
that
So
British private sailing
yeah,
ship
the
thing.
Deerhound. We'll get to the Deerhound. Let's talk about the Kearsarge first,
Sure, we can talk about the
because
Kearsarge.
there's an interesting B story to all of this, which
Mm.
is the relationship of Semmes to the captain of the
Hmm.
Kearsarge, John Ancrum Winslow. And these guys knew each other
Mm.
since the Mexican War. They were lieutenants together in the Gulf of Mexico in 1846. They both commanded vessels
Hmm.
in the Gulf of Mexico that were on blockade duty. And they both lost vessels in the same storms in 1846 and ended up sharing a cabin on
Mm.
the flagship Raritan where they got to know each other
Mm.
and wrote about each other. So when ultimately in 1864, uh, Winslow, as captain of the Kearsarge, caught up with Winslow, with
Mm.
Semmes, he knew him. He knew who he was dealing with.
Hmm.
He knew his strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
And in the book, I talk a little bit about why Semmes lost his vessel and why Winslow lost his vessel. And they lost them for very different reasons. The main point being that Semmes had rashly chased his vessel into a storm when his boat had insufficient ballast because he could never avoid a fight. If he saw an opportunity, he went for it. And Winslow observed this and knew this about him.
Mm.
And when the Kearsarge finally caught up with the Cherbourg, with the Alabama and Cherbourg Harbor, Winslow baited Semmes with a dare. So when he pulled the Kearsarge up next to the Alabama for about 15 minutes in the neutral harbor and then sailed away, he sailed out just beyond the breakwater in international water, rose the highest, the biggest flag he could find on the highest mast, and sailed back and forth, daring, daring Sims to come out. And Sims has a conversation with his first mate, John Kell, and says, and they talk about it. And Kell says, I don't know if we should do it because, the ship is slow. And by the way, the ammunition is damp.
Hmm.
And Sims replies to him, Mr. Kell, I am tired of running from that flaunting rag. And then he goes out into the battle,
Hmm.
and the better prepared Kearsarge vanquishes
Right.
the Alabama. And yeah, Winslow prepared very well by placing armor on the side of his vessel, but that was, hardly unfair. Everybody
Yeah.
knew about it. Even Semmes saw it and knew about it,
Hmm.
and it had been common practice,
Right. Right.
and it was not the reason why uh, the Kearsarge won the battle.
Right.
One of many reasons. I would say that the chief reason was that Winslow was extremely well prepared with a ship that was really ship shape and a
Mm.
crackerjack crew who knew how to aim the cannons with really good ammunition
Well, he had
and
a trained crew in
a
contrast to,
trained crew. Semmes had none of that.
yeah. Uh, but we do want to go back to the Deerhound because
Okay,
I'm not going to
so
let you off that one.
there was a vessel in Cherbourg Harbor known as the Deerhound, which was a private yacht. There is even to this day controversy about whether it was a consort vessel of the Alabama, but it was certainly owned by a Confederate sympathizer, and it um, followed the Alabama out into international waters and stood by while the battle took place. And when the Alabama began to founder, the Deerhound's boats participated in the rescue, but selectively picked up Confederate officers. So ultimately, when the Deerhound left the scene, it had 20 officers and about 20 crew, which of course is nothing like the ratio of officer crew on the
Right.
vessel. And and it escaped to Liverpool with Semmes, but on its way, before it left the scene, it destroyed a lifeboat
Mm.
while the Kearsarge was picking up men in the water for a full half an hour
Mm.
after the Deerhound left.
Right.
So the accusation has been made, and I certainly um, think there's a lot of room, a lot of reason to accept this, that the Deerhound abandoned men drowning in the water,
Mm.
and among those
Mhm.
drowning was White.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it counters what, like, one of the 10 lies that Sims tells, that he was helping and rescuing people when
Oh,
clearly
he says
he's
we
not
we
doing
went
it.
out of our way to rescue all of the boys.
Yeah. Which is like clearly not the case.
Clearly not the case. Neither the no the Deerhound did not rescue any boys
No.
the re- at all. Yeah,
It,
and destroyed a lifeboat. Let's not forget that.
yeah, that's
Sank a
that's
lifeboat.
cruel. That's very cruel.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you have crew members who can't swim on
Mm-hmm.
board.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that's, and yeah, it it does raise the sort of like the, as we're kind of drawing here to the close slowly, that
Mm-hmm.
it is an interesting situation with regard to the remembrance of this, because that's sort of what you're you're partly aiming the book at as well. It's not just telling the story of White, but you're also wanting people to recognize, I felt that there's a lot of misremembrance and letting individuals like Sims dominate the way we remember the Alabama story.
Yeah, I try to make that as vivid as I can. It goes back to my earlier point that what's as important as what is told as what is not told.
Hmm.
And in the specific case of the survivors of
Hmm.
this battle, there's a very interesting newspaper article in Liverpool Mercury, which is entitled The Official Report of Those Saved, Killed, and Drowned from the Battle. And what's fascinating about it is, well, first of all, it documents that no boys were saved by the deerhound at all. Uh, but the even more important is what is omitted from the list, and that is that White is not mentioned on the list of those killed and drowned. And so the point I'm making there is that the final manifestation of the racist world in which he lived
Hmm.
was that at the end he remained invisible.
Yeah, yeah, literally
The
invisible.
invisibility is the point.
Hmm.
So this also goes back to your opening question about how do you tell the story about
Hmm.
someone for whom there's so little information? And the
Yeah.
answer is the point is that there's so little information.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
we can assume that Sam's probably had a hand in that report that got published in the Liverpool papers that he on purpose omits the name of the slave he ki or the black individual
Individual.
he kidnapped and enslaves on his ship.
Yeah, so that when he writes his memoir, he can make up a story.
Yeah, yeah, and
Mhm.
that I think that's the exact word choice, right? It's like he makes up a story about this individual.
Mhm.
He he lies about it.
Yeah. And you've referred a few times to the chapter which is called An Ocean of Lies.
Hmm.
And there are 10 lies that I
Hmm.
uh, uh, unpack in that chapter, the summary chapter. One of them, I mean, at the very opening of his passage, he says, I took from the Tonawanda one of her passengers, a slave that even in the first 4 or 5 words is a lie, because White was never a passenger, he was crew. And Semmes, who was a naval officer, more than anybody you and I know, knows the difference between passenger and crew.
Right.
So the lies start at the beginning and they go right through.
Yeah. Um, so what, as sort of the final question, what do you hope
Mhm.
the impact will be of your book? How do you hope like will this change the way we like think of the war on the sea or during the American Civil War? Will this change sort of um like maybe some of the uncritical worship of Sims? Like what do you think what would you like the big like best case world impact?
Well, like any revisionist history, it's a different way of telling a large story.
Hmm.
So I tried to tell the story of the maritime war not through the prism of a great ideological conflict, although it's that, but through the eyes and experience of one individual. It's an unconventional way of telling it, but that's
Hmm.
what I'm trying to do. And I believe that the ultimate takeaway has tremendous resonance with what's going on today
Hmm.
because we're talking about the erasure
Hmm.
of Black history.
Hmm.
And what's going on in America today is also a systematic effort to erase Black history. This is not something that's new in America.
Hmm.
This is something which
Hmm.
has been going on for a long time. And my point is that here is a way of making it vivid,
Hmm.
both because it pertains to one individual whose real story we can document,
Hmm.
and because the person who wrote about him was an empowered individual with
Hmm.
a racist agenda, which we call the lost cause. So, in the sense that this is a vivid refutation of that, it resonates with the erasure of Black history today. And then the final point I would make is that although White's story is tragic,
Hmm.
it doesn't fit into the narrative of heroism that
Hmm.
we're all familiar with.
Right.
It is, in a curious way, quite heroic because the actual circumstances of his life
Mhm.
belie the racist narrative that his captors sought to construct. In that way, his life assumes tremendous importance uh, from a historical point of view.
I can't add anything to that. That is a brilliant line to end with for our conversation. So, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the book. And I'm gonna remind re listeners, if you stuck with us to this point, this was a conversation about Kidnapped at Sea, the Soul War Voyage of David Henry White by with John Hopkins University Press.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm very happy.
Good.